His military success earned him the nickname Unconditional Surrender. A graduate of West Point, he served in the Mexican War, but later resigned his commission in the Army and lived in poverty. When the Civil War began, he joined the Union Army in the West and led it to victories at Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga. President Lincoln promoted him to lieutenant general, and he headed the Army of the Potomac's efforts to defeat Confederates under Robert E. Lee. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox, and Grant was promoted to general of the Army. He briefly served as interim Secretary of War under President Johnson and soon received the Republican presidential nomination. During his 2 terms as president, he championed civil liberties and had some foreign policy successes, but his administration was also engulfed in scandal. He retired from the presidency and unsuccessfully sought renomination 4 years later. He spent his final months in a cottage in upstate New York, writing his wartime memoirs. He was our nation's 18th chief executive, Ulysses S. Grant. Let's take a look on a map at some sites associated with Ulysses S. Grant. Now, Grant moved around a lot during his life, and of course, much of his life was spent in the military. So there's a lot of different sites that you can visit where you can really feel Grant's presence. Certainly, there are many Civil War sites. Too many to go through them all now and show you photos and everything, but I'll mention a few briefly. Certainly, Fort Donelson in Tennessee is a site worth seeing. That's actually where Grant got his nickname Unconditional Surrender. The site of the Battle of Shiloh, and certainly Vicksburg, which is down a little bit south of this map, the site of the long siege that finally ended in July of 1863. Chattanooga, and then when Grant moved to the east, a series of battles in the area around Richmond, places like Cold Harbor, down to Petersburg and the Battle of the Crater, and then Appomattox Courthouse. There's a very nice site at Appomattox that you can visit. They basically reconstructed the town, and not only can you see where Lee surrendered to Grant, but you can also get a good sense of what the town looked like in 1865. So Grant was born in Point Pleasant, Ohio, along the Ohio River, down in this region here. You can visit his birthplace. And nearby in the town is the town of Georgetown. The Grants moved there shortly after his birth, and there is a home there and a schoolhouse reconstructed that you can tour. Grant's wife, Julia, was from St. Louis, and Grant was actually married in St. Louis and lived there for a time. You can visit a National Park Service site, the Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site in St. Louis. Just before the Civil War, he moved to Galena, Illinois, which is up in this part of the state, again along the Mississippi. And when the war was over, the town of Galena, the citizens of Galena, gave him a house which he lived in for a while, and before his presidency and a bit after his presidency. That is also a historical site that you can see. His final years, though, were spent in a cottage in upstate New York, and we'll take a look at that on a separate map in a moment. One other site worth mentioning, though, in Mississippi, and this part of Mississippi, is the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library and Museum, which just opened a few years ago. Now let's take a look at the next map. This is a map of New York State and New England. Grant spent the final months of his life in his cottage in upstate New York writing his memoirs. And that cottage was in Wilton, in this general area here, close to Saratoga Springs. And that is a historic site there that you can visit today. When he died in 1885, Grant was buried in New York City. He's buried in Grant's tomb along the Hudson River in Upper Manhattan. Now let's take a look at some photographs at some sites pertaining to President Grant. Now let's take a look at some books in my library relating to Ulysses S. Grant. Many of you are probably aware of the book by Ron Chernow, Grant, which came out last year and which I understand is very good and has had great reviews. I've not yet read it. Another good book that just came out in 2018, shortly before that book, is American Ulysses, A Life of Ulysses S. Grant by Ronald C. White. And it's a little bit shorter than Chernow's book, so if you're looking for a shorter biography, it is very good. I, of course, have a lot of Civil War books that Grant features in. Again, I think too many to go through now. But I would commend to you Grant's memoirs, the personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. They were published originally in 1885. Grant finished them just before his death in July of 1885 at his cottage in Wilton, New York. He was actually dying of throat cancer while he was writing his memoirs, and to everyone's surprise, they're actually very well written. No one knew that Grant was that good of a writer. They came out after Grant died. So a couple of other things to mention that were happening during this time period. It was during the Grant administration in 1876 that the Battle of Little Bighorn occurred in Wyoming. This is, of course, George Armstrong Custer in Sitting Bull. This is a good book, The Last Stand, Custer, Sitting Bull, and the Battle of the Little Bighorn by Nathaniel Philbrick. It was published in 2010. There's another book that's in the form of a novel called Son of the Morning Star, Custer and the Little Bighorn, which you might also be interested in. Our next episode will take a look at our nation's 19th president, Rutherford B. Hayes.